whenever's good for you. Yeah. Is Marathon generally known as a very prompt community?
Yes. No, not really. No.
Clearly the Alpiners are not. So.
Well, I guess we can just jump in. Hi, everybody. My name is Tim Gibbs, and I'm the park archaeologist at Big Bend Ranch State Park. And I want to thank Dara Cavanis and the Marathon Public Library for hosting this Knowledge Night, giving me the opportunity to share some of the work that I've been doing and will be continuing to do along the Big Bend Ranch River Corridor. So without further ado, I guess just first off, how many of y'all are familiar with Big Bend Ranch? No, I recognize some of you from down there, but never know, because this is a big community and it's a big space, and Big Bend National Park tends to capture most of the attention. So Big Bend Ranch State Park, for those of y'all who are not familiar, is roughly 315,000 acres just to the west of Big Bend National Park. At our closest, we're about a mile apart in sunny Lajitas on the Rio Grande. We are very similar to the national park, but also very different. It's a very different experience. It's much more constrained. We have many different physiographic regions. And in this particular presentation, we're going to talk about the river corridor. And so the river corridor represents roughly 45 miles between Lajitas and Presidio, Texas, of which we have in the neighborhood of about 32 miles. Just to back up a little bit, you can see that the river corridor represents a very tiny piece of the overall Big Bend Ranch. So within the park, this image displays the distribution of sites, currently up to 627 sites. Compare that with almost 4,000 in the national park. The national park has seen substantial projects over the last 50 years. We've had less than 10% of our project formally surveyed. And if you look at those points and the point distribution there, you'll notice that most of them are linear. And that's because most of this is associated with roads and trails and power line infrastructure. And that's what drives most of the work. And so this project is driven by a little bit of the work. The river corridor represents our most intensively utilized part of the park. Mostly because that's where the pavement is. That's where most of the campgrounds are, and that's where the river is. Sometimes, not really right now. But as a function of that, what drives pretty much all of the work that I do is the mission statement for Parks and Wildlife. The TLDR here is that it's a balance between providing access to the park for recreation and for hunting, for education, but also conserving the natural and cultural resources in the park. And that's oftentimes quite a difficult balancing act. And that is also driven by the Texas State Antiquities Code, which guides how we interact with archaeological sites and with historic sites, and moreover sets the stage for how we go about trying to preserve them. So I follow and this is a really generic sort of cartoon, if you will, but I follow this sort of generic cycle of investigation. And so it's a fairly linear process, but it's also an additive process. It feeds on itself, it's iterative. Most of those 620 sites within the park, 627 sites in the park, most of those were recorded by my predecessors, starting as early as the 1930s with J. Charles Kelly, who's a prominent archaeologist in the region and who effectively defined most of the chronological traditions that we still sort of follow today. He was way ahead of his time, and he set that framework. Now, the problematic part is that he wasn't great at mapping the locations of his sites, which is sort of where I come in, somewhere between the discovery and the monitoring portion of this cycle. And by monitoring, I don't mean watching heavy machinery dig holes, because that's also one of the definitions of that term, but rather a big part of my job, and a big part of what I've been doing for the last 12 years now, is physically going to these places and looking at the mechanisms that are impacting these sites, and trying to get a sense of, what are the threats, but also, what are the mechanisms that have led to these sites being preserved in the first place. And so with the river corridor being the most heavily utilized part of the park, a combination of infrastructure projects as well as just some accidents associated with maintenance, which you will have, as well as just erosion, have led to the initiation of this project to revisit these sites along the river corridor and to evaluate them. And so that was really started in about 2015, between 2015 and 2018. And within this roughly 30-mile corridor, there are roughly 30 archaeological sites that are still preserved enough that you can actually recognize on the surface that something is there. So in the function of the site condition monitoring or assessment of long-term change, we are primarily looking to evaluate their condition and also assess their both research potential, but also their eligibility towards state antiquities landmark and National Historic Register places eligibility. And that's one of the things that's dictated by the Antiquities Code. That is a big part of my job. And so finding these sites is frequently the harder part than actually evaluating them, unfortunately due to the nature of when these sites were recorded. Most of them were recorded before GPS. So that literally took me about 3 years to relocate all of these sites. Not all of that 3 years. You can only really put in about 6 months of real field work at a time down there for fairly obvious reasons. But after those 3 years, I was able to get a really good sense about the types of sites that are present along the river corridor. Most of the sites along the river corridor are prehistoric in nature. With that said, standing on top of one of these sites, it's really hard to make sense of how that fits into that prehistoric timeline. Most of these, as you can tell from these photos on the lower end, they consist of chipped stone, what we refer to as débitage, which is just French for shatter, as well as extensive distributions, extensive piles sometimes of fire-cracked rock that was produced in the process of processing various foodstuffs. More on that later. But there's also other types of sites down there, as well as some really interesting early 20th century, late 19th century historic structures that predate most of the historic ranches that we really know. We think of the Bogles and the Folks. In a lot of cases, these are ranchitos that were in place in the 1870s and 1880s, and there's really little more than piles of rubble left. And so that kind of segues into the monitoring part of it. Road construction, farming and ranching, movie sets. Who would know that a movie set could be so destructive? We have 2 sites that have been significantly impacted by movie sets. But the biggest driver of most of the substantive damage to these archaeological sites is the river itself. And as most of y'all who were here in 2008 remember, I don't know if you got a chance to go down and see it, but that was a big event. I was living in Arizona at the time, and it was on the news in Flagstaff. massive flooding along the Rio Grande and the damage that it did to the communities of Ojinaga and Presidio and to that poor golf course in Lajitas. But you can see over on the right, for those of y'all who know where Fort Leaton State Historic Site is, the river's not that close. And the river was literally up to the edge of that site. At one point in that flood, the river crested at roughly 28 feet and was flowing at, for you river guides and river enthusiasts, flowing at roughly 52,000 CFS. And then it dropped after that crest and hung around 30,000 CFS for another, I think, couple of weeks. And so that creates just a massively chaotic, destructive environment. And so it's pretty easy to see what's destroying most of the archaeology along the river, and it's the river itself. And so at the conclusion of this initial site monitoring process, there were questions, you know. The initial observations were that most of these sites are gone. Most of these sites are destroyed. It's highly unlikely that anything's preserved. And when you think about the Rio Grande and you think about the 2008 flood and the historic floods, the floods in 1991 and 1992, the flood in 1978. There was a flood that it's hard to know whether the gauge was accurate or not, but in 1904 it was 102,000 CFS. That is a massive destructive event, and we can imagine that there were events like that marching all through prehistory. And so the assumption has been for decades, even starting with J. Charles Kelly himself, that the river corridor is not a place you're going to find buried sites. We literally just haven't been looking because it's just such what we would refer to as a geomorphically dynamic environment that in these big floods, these big chaotic maelstroms, you have cutting and filling kind of at the same time. And so it just doesn't provide an environment where you would have stable deposition over time where you would expect to find buried archaeology. But fortunately, our regional coordinator with the Texas Historical Commission said that's a great story, but until you dig some holes to prove that story, we just don't know. So he sent me packing. He didn't accept my conclusions, which in hindsight turns out to be a good thing. And so I came back into the field with these research questions, which mostly center around questions of preservation and integrity. And fundamentally, the question is, are there places along the Rio Grande that still preserve archaeology, despite the force of the Rio Grande? And if so, what level of integrity does it preserve? And so in 2022, with a freshly minted permit from the Texas Historical Commission in hand, we started shovel testing sites along this river corridor. And I spent most of the 2022-23 field season shovel testing in creosote flats and in mesquite thickets and on gravel terraces, because it's a gravel terrace. I don't think there's going to be anything there, but you don't know until you look. And so as a function of this process, it became really clear that there was a lot more there than I had ever anticipated in that buried environment. And 260 shovel tests later, by the conclusion of that field season, we had at least 6 sites that had buried components, or what we suspected to be buried components, going down as deep as 80 to 100 centimeters, roughly, let's just say a meter or a yard below ground, 3 feet below ground. Unfortunately, shovel testing has a limitation of basically the length of the shovel's handle, so there are diminishing returns that don't allow us to really dig any deeper. But fortunately, most of the impacts that the park has in mind also don't go a lot deeper. Roads, water lines, campsites, they typically have a fairly shallow impact. So the arrow points that are shown in there also were showing up in a very high density. We had 5 arrow points and 1 mono, a grinding stone, show up in our shovel tests. And that might not seem special just at the outset, but in the previous 20 years of digging shovel tests across this state and other states, I have found 1 projectile point in a shovel test. And to find 5 concentrated in one, fairly tightly bound area was a really good indicator that something else was going on, and that maybe our assumptions weren't borne out. And fortunately, the team that came out to help me from Austin, the Archeological Services team of Texas Parks and Wildlife under our Cultural Resources Program, they are not constrained by my assumptions and our dogma that we've been operating on within this area. And they started paying really close attention. In fact, one person in particular, Marnie Francel, was just obsessed with the natural arroyo cuts that were bisecting all of these river corridor terraces. And again, these are places that I haven't been looking because nothing should be preserved there, right? So what she found was not nothing. What she found were a series of linear rocks and charcoal and a couple of flakes, but they're always linear. And when you see linear things like that exposed in a creek cut bank, one of the things that it can be is a buried surface or a buried cultural horizon, as we would refer to them, but oftentimes a zone. And so based on this information, plus the returns of our shovel testing endeavor, we felt that it justified the employment of a geomorphologist, a geoarchaeologist, or I like to call them dirt surgeons, because they go in and they ask questions in ways that I simply can't. And so Drs. Charles Frederick and Augustus Costa, they came down in a mercifully fairly cool April 2023 and conducted a series of investigations, reconnaissance investigations at a number of the sites where we had observed these possibly buried elements. And what they found in a function of effectively cutting these vertical surfaces and cleaning them very closely were buried horizons, and not just individual horizons, but in some cases multiple horizons. And in one really notable case, 8 individual buried horizons stacked right on top of one another. They collected samples every 5 centimeters, every, 2 inches basically down this roughly 10-foot exposure at this one site, but as well as at the profile cuts at least 2 other sites. And they took those samples back to their lab. They literally used a laser size sorter to size the grains, as well as some tests for magnetic susceptibility of the soils. And what they found is that at many of these sites, you have completely preserved flood cycles, what they refer to as a cyclotherm. And these flood cycles indicate a level of integrity such that when a flood deposits, it's not being wiped away. It's not being reset. Instead, you're having floods lay down deposits, that surface is being occupied, and then another flood lays down a deposit. Lather, rinse, repeat, you end up with a series of horizons that are positive for human activity, that are separated by otherwise sterile material. And this represents what we like to refer to as a layer cake, or a layer cake strata. And it represents the gold standard for establishing prehistoric archeological chronologies. Because you can take a sample within one portion of that zone, and you can get a date, and then you can basically apply that date transitively across that entire horizon. And then you can also take a date at the bottom, you can take a date at the top, and that actually helps you bracket the entire span of time that passed during all of those individual flood events. And so in this particular case, we have 8 individual buried horizons separated by sterile alluvium. We have a radiocarbon date at the bottom of, am I jumping ahead? A little bit. We have a radiocarbon date at the bottom, and we have a radiocarbon date at, I'm calling that occupation 1, and in reality the surface probably should be 1, but regardless, within that band, we returned dates of 1557 at the top and 1315 at the bottom. So roughly 300 years across 10 feet of alluvial deposition, which speaks to the amount of sediment that can be carried in these massive floods. But it also speaks to the importance of the reuse of place. And it indicates that this site was revisited pretty regularly across that time. Moreover, we found a series of diagnostic projectile points. And so diagnostic projectile points simply refers to the observed fact that through time, people transition from one particular type of dart point or arrow point over another for one reason or another. And I have some thoughts on that. But in this case, the Toya arrow point is a type that we find. It was one of those that was in one of the previous slides. That is a type that we find all over the Big Bend, including up in this area. Whereas the Perdiz is a type that we find not only in the Big Bend, but we find across the state of Texas, into Oklahoma and New Mexico. It's a very widespread type. But the thing is, we don't understand the relationships between these because we simply have not found them within a site like this. Typically, they're all on one surface, what we call a palimpsest. Don't worry, there's not a quiz afterwards. But on these palimpsest sites, deflation basically just causes all of any deposited soil that erodes away to just basically collapse in on itself. And you end up with this mixed up mishmash of history all just piled on itself. The term palimpsest actually refers to historic papyri, historic documents from a time when the actual paper itself was worth more than what was written on it. So oftentimes you would have a message and then it would be erased and then rotated in another message, and that would end up with a garbled message that you would basically have to require you a computer to tease apart. And so we are effectively using the same term. And that term describes most of the archaeology in the Big Bend. Most of the sites in the entire region are palimpsest sites that are just piled on these very old, long time-averaged surfaces. But not here. Not here. Based on the carbon dates, based on the number of buried horizons, these are short occupations. These are little snapshots in time of people occupying these sites, which is uniquely interesting and also very valuable for addressing research questions. And so our test excavations at the Dark Canyon Eddy site in our first season, basically I had this profile that the geomorphologists had scraped and cleaned up, and I thought it might be nice to actually have some artifacts associated with that, so I excavated directly behind it, finding the carbon dates or finding the carbon samples and the arrow points that were depicted in the last slide. Those 2 points over in the lower right hand, the very far right corner is the Toya point, and the one on the left is Perdiz. And so one of the other really unique things about this environment that we're finding down there is that it also preserves buried surfaces. In this photo on the left, that is what we refer to as a mud drape. And if any of y'all have had your house flooded, you know exactly what a mud drape is. It's that fine clay silt that settles out when the water drops away, and it just blankets your floor, it blankets everything that was on the floor. And in this case, it blankets prehistoric surfaces that are between 300, quick math, 300 and 600 years old. And so these surfaces, because the water was very slow, as the energy dropped out and as the water started to recede, it laid these mud drapes down on these surfaces that we can then come in and pop away and literally find exactly what was left behind. They haven't been scoured, they haven't been eroded. They are intact prehistoric surfaces. And this is, to my knowledge, the first that have ever been found in the Big Bend. I'm only aware of one other site along the Rio Grande. It's actually in the Lower Pecos that was excavated about 7 years ago that had this phenomenon, and it was kind of surprising for them as well. And again, thanks to the dirt surgeon, I was able to anticipate this. Otherwise, I probably would have dug right through that, to be quite honest with you. So the second field season, 2023 to 2024, we focused on a number of sites that, again, we were pretty sure were destroyed and have been managing them as if they were destroyed. Without giving too much away, this is an aerial photo of a place that's on the Western River Corridor that some of you may know as Crowtown, especially for you Larry McMurtry fans. This was a movie set for the CBS miniseries, Streets of Laredo. Hasn't aged well, if you haven't seen it in a while. But at any rate, they left everything there. They had bulldozed pretty much the entire surface and built these fake ticky-tacky adobes, which, to be honest with you, I kind of thought were real adobes because they used real adobe for whatever reason, which is crazy. Who's got that kind of budget? At any rate, one of the test units, one of 3 test units at this site, sort of within an area that honestly looked really blown out, it turned out to produce over 5,000 artifacts. Mostly chipped stone, but also ground stone, pieces of bone, there were pieces of mussel shell, likely from food taken out of the Rio Grande. There were fish bones, but moreover, there were several projectile points, including the tiniest projectile point I am aware of ever found in this region, or really any region for that matter. Unfortunately, I don't have the photo of it sitting on the other side of the penny, but that point sits entirely on the Lincoln Memorial on the backside of a penny, and mostly obscures Honest Abe's face. So, just for a point of reference, with the now 360 shovel tests and 20 test units that have been excavated, we still have just under 10,000 artifacts that have been found. And more than half of them came from one unit on this site, which is a lot. And sites out here don't accumulate that kind of stuff, by and large, because people have to be in one place for a really long time to accumulate that level of detritus. And where that happens is in villages. And so we think that this might be one of J. Charles Kelly's village sites that he recorded back in the day and unfortunately didn't plot so great on one of those old USGS 15-minute maps, which in his defense is pretty tough. Also at this site, we have what is generally referred to as an earth oven. And earth ovens are really important features on the landscape out here. They tend to sequester a lot of carbon, so they provide us unique opportunities to get radiocarbon dates. They also oftentimes, they're made of rock, so they tend to be really durable, so they tend to also sequester pollens and seeds, and they can tell us a lot about the prehistoric economy. And I've been looking for good earth ovens in this project area, and this is what passed as a good earth oven. And honestly, I wasn't even sure what it was going to look like, because at the surface it was literally just a small aggregation of rocks, maybe about 1.5 feet across. Through careful excavation, you can see that in the middle photo, after getting down about, I believe, 6 to 8 inches, the first couple of levels, we start exposing large elements. And by the time we get to the bottom of the feature, we have this really prominent circular ring of large basalt cobbles. And we think of these cobbles as thermal elements, because effectively what they were doing, and I have a better photo of this, we've got this cartoon up in the left-hand corner. What they were doing is they were creating these basin-shaped pits, lining them with rock, and then filling them with wood, lighting that off, and then lining the edge with that hot rock, and then putting a package of food into it, where it then cooks for 36 to 48 hours. And this technology is the heart of the archaic adaptation. Work that the Center for Big Bend Studies has done on the Lykes Duncan, we're on the O2 Ranch, the Lykes Duncan site, has indicated that this technology may go back as old as 11,600 years. And some even think that this might have even originated in the Big Bend or within the vicinity of northern Mexico. So this has been a key adaptation to this region for a very, very long time. These photos are actually, were taken by Edward Curtis in the 1880s, I believe, of Mescalero Apache, who get their name, Mescaleros, mezcal eaters, because they cook mezcal or agave within these pits. And so on the left, you can see some women tending the pit and actually opening it and pulling out the cooked agave. And on the right, what that cooked agave looks like. Now, the downside of this technology is that when it's done correctly, it doesn't leave anything in the pit. So we have very little evidence that this is actually what they were doing. And our best evidence actually comes from outside the area, from places where the cooks didn't do a good job, and they overcooked their food, and we have carbonized agave in those pits. And when I say it's a few, I mean it's like 3 of these features are basically defining our understanding of this kind of entire technology for this region. But at any rate, large samples were taken, and we're actually in the process of processing those, and we'll hopefully get a better sense about the economic pursuits of the people occupying the site. One of the other sites that we looked at, 41 PS 116, that is, for those of y'all familiar with the park, that is the Arenosa site, and that is also known as the Arenosa Campground, which has been a public campground for a little over 30 years. And over the last decade or so, I've been watching stuff eroding out of it. All the while with the assumption, with the understanding that what we're seeing is just the last of some scattered remains from a site that's largely been eaten by river floods, which was completely wrong, because shovel testing there produced a number of projectile points, and subsequent test excavations found the remains of another earth oven, or at least the clean-out episode from a nearby earth oven, as well as a turquoise bead, which, for you geologists, doesn't come from here. We were talking about working in dusty environments. That's my springtime kit over on the far upper left. That was also what I was wearing this morning when I was backfilling test units from this week's project. And so what we found at this site was that we conducted 6 test units, and these are just 1 meter by 1 meter units, typically dug about a meter deep, so that they can give us a higher resolution snapshot than a simple hole in the ground. And what these units told us is that, should have brought a laser pointer, is that we also have buried surfaces. This is a buried hard pan surface, roughly, I believe, 80 centimeters. Actually, you can see some of it there. Roughly 80 centimeters below the surface. Oh, no, it's this level. So, and it also preserved 2 cultural horizons that produced large amounts of charcoal and chipped stone and fire-cracked rock and other evidence of human occupation. All of this sitting right underneath campsite number 4. And so this is where we go back to the cycle of archaeological investigation. now we have evidence. Now we have evidence that not only is there an intact site there, but there is a high value, high integrity site there, which led to our recent decommissioning of that site. We dumped about 8 cubic yards of sterile gravel over the top of the site, and we blocked it off with bollards. People can still camp on top of it, but no longer are we seeing artifacts eroding out. Those artifacts are now going to be conserved in the site, in the ground, and we're going to monitor that site, and hopefully it's going to go another 30 years before any substantial damage forces our hand to do any additional work. And so this season, I'm already, I guess, 8 weeks into my field season. That's what my shoulder and knee says, at least. And fortunately, we haven't found any more stunning recovery. And I say fortunately because most of the sites that we've been looking at in this field season, they're inside of campgrounds. They're inside of public facilities. They're in places where having a big, important archaeological site, while very cool and informative, is also highly problematic. And so one of the big goals of this project is to identify those places. And more importantly, to identify those sites that have high research potential and have the capacity to inform larger, more enigmatic research questions, which, brace yourself, we're going to talk about now. And this is where we get into some wild speculation. And in this case, maybe not so wild speculation. Because one of the things that this project has shown is a lot of exotic materials. And by a lot, I mean, like, honestly, 15 artifacts. But these 15 artifacts, they come from places that aren't anywhere near the Big Bend. They come from places that aren't anywhere near La Junta de los Rios. They come from Casas Grandes. They come from the Ornata Mogollon region of El Paso. And more importantly, they demonstrate connection to larger trade networks that connected the Puebloan world with the Mesoamerican world between 900 and roughly 1400 AD. These were trade networks in prestige goods, marine shell, obsidian, lots of turquoise. I was actually just at Paquime 2 weeks ago in Chihuahua, and they have all of this stuff on display, and they have hundreds of thousands of artifacts that have landed there in the middle of the Chihuahuan desert, hundreds of miles from the ocean, but there they are. Tens of thousands of shells, all sorts of inlaid goods. And we don't see that here. And so the fact that we're only 200-ish miles as the crow flies speaks to the relationship that this place had with these ceremonial centers of the Mogollon and of the Casas Grandes people. But what does it say? It's really difficult to parse out, but likely there was less of a direct connection, and it's more of a secondary connection. The people of La Junta were likely connected to the Ornata Mogollon and to the Casas Grande Mogollon via clan and familial lines. And the timing of when these artifacts actually show up on these sites is of keen interest, because that also speaks to how those artifacts would have gotten here. For those of you who are not familiar with Mogollon archaeology, the Mogollon, builders of pueblos and pit houses alike, large-scale farmers, their lifeway effectively stopped in its tracks roughly 1350 AD. And similarly, about 100 years later, the people of Paquime stopped building. And that's important to note, because Paquime, when it was first observed in, I believe, 1537 by the Spanish, was over 4 stories tall. 4-story, maybe even 5-story tall adobe building. And for those of y'all familiar with adobe, you know that it has to be constantly maintained to stand. So when you stop building, you've kind of stopped everything. And so we think of that as sort of a collapse. Collapse is a really loaded term, but at the very least, it's a collapse of a social field and a social system. It doesn't necessarily mean that the people left, but they stopped doing what they were doing. And that's important, because in La Junta, they didn't. In La Junta, we see populations rising in this time. We see populations living at least part of the year in villages, all the way up until the Spanish occupations in the 17th century. And so those relationships remain big open questions. And the presence of these artifacts at these sites gives us some, at least, hint that some of these sites may still contain artifacts that could help answer these questions. Similarly, I had mentioned that the Toya and Perdiz, these are really common arrow point types. And so arrow points are, diagnostic arrow points. We connect those to the people who made them. And for whatever reason, they changed. These styles changed. They go in and out of favor. But we can surmise that that's all also connected to social fields, that these are skills that are being taught from person to person, and people are copying each other's styles. And so it's these connections between people that these are effectively surrogates for. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very interested in these particular points. Because around roughly 1350 AD, we stopped seeing the Toya point. And I say roughly because we have very few dates on this particular point style, because we have very few buried sites, because we have very few environments in this part of the Chihuahuan Desert that will preserve these kind of things. So having buried sites with these artifact assemblages in place, in association, in non-eroded environments with high integrity, provide an opportunity to figure out what happened here. And over on the left, you'll see a map of what an archaeologist by the name of Leroy Johnson referred to as the classic Toya area versus the expanded Toya area. And Toya was a name that he and J. Charles Kelly came up with for a late Holocene prehistoric occupation just before the Spanish showed up, so just at the cusp of the beginning of history. And a lot of archaeologists have suggested that the Umano, that many of you have probably heard of, which were a group that were documented by the Spanish in La Junta de los Rios and in this region, were either the Toya or they were associated with Toya. But the Toya complex is a very difficult question to get at, because it doesn't appear to have been just one people. What it might have been is multiple different nations that all shared the same tool sets, which is kind of strange because it also indicates that they probably shared the same social field. An archaeologist friend of mine by the name of John Arn III has hypothesized that this is actually what the early Spanish, or the people who the early Spanish were talking to, were referring to when they meant Tejas. That Tejas isn't friend, Tejas is ally. Tejas is an allied nation, it's an allied people. It was a word that was common amongst multiple different languages, which in and of itself is pretty strange, but it indicates a shared social field. And so the fact that they're sharing words and the fact that they're sharing technology suggests that they were sharing more than that. It looks like they were also connected by feasting traditions. Feasting traditions were documented across the Mexican frontier from West Mexico well into the Caddo Hidacho country of East Texas. And they refer to these as mitotes. And typically they're spoken of in really judgmental terms by Spanish priests who took issue with these flagrant displays of idolatry, as they would have referred to them. During these mitotes, people would frequently consume psychotropic drugs, they would consume alcohol, they would dance, and they would engage in the sort of things that happen at parties. But the Spanish documented mitotes that included hundreds of people, with some along the Rio Grande that might have had as many as 600 to 700 participants. And some of the sites within my project area include these massive earth ovens that are 6 to 8 meters across. So we're talking, almost an oven almost 20 feet across. It would have taken a team of people just to build it, much less gather all of the wood and all of the food and tend the fire, and not to mention the amount of food that it would have produced. And so just based on the scale alone, we're drawing a connection between this archaeological site type, this feature type, and the mitote event. And so there are multiples of these large features. There may be as many as 30 across Big Bend Ranch. And they're actually pretty common features across this region. One of the things about these type of feasting events is that it's feasting cultures across the world who engage in these sorts of things. They typically occur along margins, so boundaries. And if you think of these events as means for neighbors to come together and coordinate their activities, especially in a place like the Chihuahuan Desert where foragers absolutely could clean out all of the edible foodstuff within a valley in a very short time, you would have had that kind of coordination in between groups to mitigate the effects of population, conflicts, and to mitigate violence. And so these mitotes would have formed a really important role in these societies and appear to have formed sort of the core of the Toya culture. They appear to have been very, very important. What's also important about them is that in feasting cultures, they tend to concentrate prestige goods. And so these are the sites where we're finding the exotic materials. This is where we're finding the obsidian and the decorated pottery and the weird things, the turquoise beads, the things that we just don't see everywhere. They're coming to these types of sites, which adds some further weight that these might represent what the Spanish were referring to as mitotes. But there's still so much work to be done before we can really speak with any confidence toward this. One of the last big research questions, at least as it associates with La Junta, is about pottery. And so I would argue most of y'all are familiar with an archaeological site or multiple archaeological sites in this region. And you probably didn't see any pottery on them because pottery is really rare. Hunter-gatherers rarely use pottery. We don't see pottery introduced into this region until roughly 900 AD, and those are some really spurious dates that absolutely I would not hang my hat on. And so the role of pottery in La Junta is one of the chief questions that J. Charles Kelly posed and that archaeologists have been struggling with in the Big Bend ever since. And so one of the things that fortunately was initiated before I started at Big Bend Ranch 13 years ago in May was a study involving pottery using both petrography, which is effectively using microscopes to look at and identify the mineral content in the temper, the paste of the pottery, but also neutron activation analysis, which actually provides us with a quantitative analysis of the composition, mostly focused on unique trace elements that might be present, such as chromium or manganese, or there's a host of different ones that we look at in these assays. And one of the reasons why we've reverted to these very expensive quantitative analyses is that most of the pottery produced in the Big Bend is plainware. It all looks the same. There's no decoration. There's no really definitive way to look at it, even with a microscope, and understand who made it, where it came from, what it was used for, until you perform NAA. And now that we have submitted We have submitted, TxDOT has submitted, the Center for Big Studies has submitted over 500 samples over the last decade of pottery to this process. We now actually have a statistically valid model for the distribution, the creation and distribution of this pottery. And what it shows is that it didn't travel far. It was being made in the villages where it was being used and where it was being consumed. This stuff wasn't being traded around. It wasn't being traded to the Ornata. It wasn't being traded up into Chupadero Mesa and some of these far-flung places. It was staying right here, which speaks to an ad hoc solution. You might ask yourself, well, why is that important? It's because to the Mogollon and to other Puebloan peoples, craft specialty was one of the hallmarks of their society. You find decorated El Paso polychrome, you know exactly where it came from and exactly who made it, and you can look at it without a microscope and you know where it came from. Any kind of decorated pottery across the Southwest has really indicative style, really unique styles that are indicative to its creator, both in terms of line and types of paint that were used, the slips, all of the different ways that each of these groups made it unique. And the people who made pottery within these groups were craft specialists. They used special tools in special places, and that is all visible archaeologically. We can see that they had craft specialists and that this was very important to them. Here, not so much. These are generalized sites. There's no evidence of craft specialty. They were making pots when they needed pots, and then when they were done with the pots, they threw them down. Which leads us to the question, what is so important about the pottery? What were they doing with this pottery that, at least before the collapse of the Mogollon world, they were importing huge amounts of? And then when that collapsed, they went through the effort to make their own, which is kind of a tall order considering some of the idiosyncratic nature of pottery. You have to be able to recognize the clay. You have to know how to temper the clay. I mean, it takes a lot of effort and time and wood in a place that doesn't have a lot of wood. And so the remaining question is, what the heck are they doing with this stuff? Is it unique to how they're processing maize? Are they using it to process black drink? Have you ever heard of black drink? You ever heard of Yopon? Okay, so black drink is Yopon tea that is boiled down. Like if you've ever made a balsamic reduction, this is a Yopon reduction. And it is also why Yopon has the name Ilex vomitus. Because apparently it was really tough to keep down, but it was also an incredibly strong drug. It has a ton of caffeine in it. And when it's cooked down, it would have been a very powerful medicine. It's actually a drink that was associated with some of the Toya mitotes, and that we think might have been in this area. Pottery could have been used to process datura or even peyote. There's a chance that they were just soup aficionados. I mean, at this point, we literally don't know. So one of the goals of this project, we actually now have we have pottery that has been taken from that village site, from that test unit. It's one of the 5,000 artifacts, but it's actually from a buried context, which means that whatever is in that pottery hasn't been damaged by the sun, it hasn't been damaged by contamination since. And so it's my hope that we can partner with the Wichita State University Archeology Food Laboratory and actually do some analysis on this to hopefully get a sense what they're using this for. So the age range for most of the La Junta wares are roughly post 1300 AD, but really all the way up into the 1700s. One of the analysts that I've worked with, he basically says this stuff it's mission Indian wear. This is the same stuff that the Manso and the Suma were making in Mission Socorro in El Paso. But the pottery that's before it, all of the pottery before was being imported in from the Mogollon world. So whatever they were doing, that pottery was important for something. But we still don't know. We still don't know when. But
Where do y'all see that line at? I mean, we used to see like in band one, you'd see the El Paso pottery and all that stuff. But is there a demarcation point established?
It's tough to say because so little of the Big Bend has been documented. A piece of Chupadero black and white pottery from Chupadero Mesa in the vicinity of Mountain Air, New Mexico, Grand Salinas, Pueblos. That was actually just found by some friends of mine doing construction on Reed's Plateau, which is just south of Terlingua. I have El Paso polychrome and some Pocky-made polychrome on a site on my property. So little bits of it we're getting around. But one of the interesting other little tidbits that you asked is that there seems to be something else going on there where, like with this plainware stuff, we'll frequently find a bunch of sherds. Like you can tell it was like a pot or a bowl that was broken and it was left in place. But with the decorated stuff, it's always just one sherd. It's always just one or two shirts with a decorated design on it. Almost as if the symbol on the design meant more than, what the actual shirt physically was. Whether that was a souvenir, whether that was a shibboleth or a signal of relationship to a particular group or social field, that would require more wild speculation. But it's something that's kind of unique to the Puebloan margins. It was actually, I was talking to an archaeologist who's done a lot of work in California in the Joshua Tree area, which is on the margin of the Puebloan world. And that's something that they see there too, where you have individual decorated pottery as if that meant something. I don't know what that means. But we don't see those designs in rock art. We don't see those designs in other preserved elements. So whatever those designs meant, they weren't being repeated here. They weren't being copied. And so it's really tough to say. In the Casas Grandes area, there's actually some thinking that various religious movements, various cults, if you will, that were cults of belief that were coming up from Mesoamerica might have been associated with those and might have actually fueled the distribution of a lot of those things. But it's really hard to say. But I could prattle on with wild speculation all night, but instead I'm going to stop here and I'm going to thank you all very much. And I am also going to do a shameless plug. I am also the regional director of the Texas Archeological Society for Far West Texas. If you are interested in learning more about the archaeology of West Texas, if you're interested in visiting our archaeological field school that we hold every year, and learning how this process works, or if you have kids that would be interested in that, or if you're interested in our annual meeting, let me know and I will